Urmas plw pigara gari, mor an tanka jadon sin Pimerant dosar gyfela am ei ffyr holiday, gydwm ni corm sio ian y diw. Y nobel hynny ni gian am antwyrasach, sy'n tei ysgrif hw trafarwbeth bwy was o'r host is iafi na geg goharach agos gyffredin beigur. Agos am ei ffyr holiday gyfer mi fain corm yn nisht, diolch smwynich is rwt ysgrif hw trafarwbeth agos na briacan ysgrifa. So my talk today is really, as Guy has said, is essentially based, it's a theme which recurred repeatedly in the thesis that I did, the work that I was doing, this constant iteration and repetition of the supposed invention of the kilt and the work that Hugh Trevor Roper had done. So I decided, well, after the thesis was over, to go back and have a detailed study of that particular piece of work by Hugh Trevor Roper. Now, I'm going to give the talk in English and I'm going to read it just for the ease of getting this recorded. Stuart is recording it today. So we will be talking for about 40 minutes and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. So I hope that I will try and be as clear about this as I can. Now, cultural historians tend, when we're talking about national formation, cultural historians tend to use the term either imagined communities, which is the more innocuous and normal phrase used as Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined communities, the sense that no individual creates a sense of their society, it's given to them through a variety of different techniques, particularly Benedict Anderson's view that the development of mass printing allowed that to emerge. Karim Bandari, in his thesis in 2012 on the political implications of tourism in Scotland, cited the fact that in the Scottish context, it is invariably and almost without exception that the term invented tradition is used, and invented tradition is a much more loaded term. And it's always the case that when we're discussing Scottish cultural traditions, it is invented tradition that is used. So I'll deal quickly with invented tradition, just the definition. Just before I do that, I should say that this is the sort of stuff that appears on the internet. My apologies for using the internet, but it illustrates the sort of information that you will see presented to you on the internet. This is a précis from a guide, one of the guides to a teaching aid. So you can see in here you've got some certain elements that recur repeatedly. You see that the elements are regarded as modern, they are culled from backward Highlanders, and we have this concept at the very end that there was no Highland culture, no distinct Highland culture prior to the 17th century. So this is what we're actually dealing with in terms of the resultant fallout of the Hugh Trevor Roper paper. And all of this stems and flows back from the original Hugh Trevor Roper paper. Now, the Hugh Trevor Roper paper was actually produced by him for a conference that was run in 1977 and was sponsored by Hobsbawm, who was a great academic, left-wing communist academic who developed the concept of invented tradition. And he defined it as a set of practices. There were normally practices which were governed by an overt set of tacitly accepted rules, often of a ritual and symbolic nature, which sought to inculcate certain values and norms of behaviour by repetition, automatically implying continuity with the past. You can see here that Hobsbawm, as a communist, is citing elites who attempt to try and socially engineer society through control of subaltern classes, the minorities within society. And you see that past and present, which was the original, they sponsored the conference in 1977, and it was originally partly funded and supported by the Communist Party of Great Britain. Now, the sole cited example that you hear, when people speak about invention of tradition or invented tradition, the sole exemplar they will quote is the invention of Highland traditions by Hugh Trevor Roper. This is unfortunate because actually within the collection of papers which subsequently appeared after the conference in 1983, there was a very good paper by David Cannadine which exposed the complete invention of all of the panoply and ceremony of the British royal family, largely invented by Edward VII. But that's skited over completely. No one ever considers that as part of invented tradition. We're channeled back to consider the paper by Hugh Trevor Roper. So what does Hugh Trevor Roper actually say? He, in 1977, produced a paper where he said essentially that the Highland traditions had been invented in order to coincide and as part of a conspiracy at the time of King George IV's visit to Edinburgh in 1822. So that was basically his notion that there had been forgeries imposed upon Scotland. So that's the paper. This is the Highland tradition of Scotland. So I decided to go back and read in some detail what that paper actually said. The big problem, of course, with that is that very few people, nobody else has done this. People have largely accepted what Hugh Trevor Roper wrote. And this is probably partly due with a point that Murray Pittock has said, was that Hugh Trevor Roper's authority as a Regius Professor of History ensured that his thesis had a much wider dissemination, and Pittock says that it was a largely unexamined idea that stated that large swathes of the popular representation of Scottish culture were authentic to the point of fraudulence. Now, most commentators, including Malcolm Chapman, David McCrone, and Tom Devine, have largely accepted this without question. This thesis has been adopted. In 1991, McCrone stated, "The gentrification of Tartan was aided considerably by Walter Scott, and he persuaded George IV, a large man," which was true, with a poor command of English, not true, but part of the conspiracy theory, obviously. And he persuaded George to come to Edinburgh, and worse, to wear the kilt, set off fetchingly with a pair of pink tights. They were actually pantaloons, not tights. Now, to Tom Devine, writing in 1994, it was a strange development, part of a wider process through which mostly imagined and false Highland traditions were absorbed by lowland elites. This Highlandism was quite literally the invention of tradition. Notice the use of Highlandism. That's practically the only time you'll see that use of Highlandism within the literature. But nobody picks up on the fact that this Highlandism is actually precisely the same form of phenomenon as Orientalism. It's a discourse that has been adopted and used and recycled. It's not actually the truth itself. The facts don't actually matter. It's the discourse. It's what is actually said that counts. So this is what we're dealing with. We're essentially dealing with Highlandism, and the basis of that Highlandism is Hugh Trevor Roper's paper. Now, essentially what Hugh Trevor Roper's paper is focusing in on is three examples of deception: Macpherson's Ossian, Tartan Setts, and the Little Kilt itself. Now, to most visitors to Scotland nowadays, Macpherson's Ossian is largely a closed book. And few nowadays are exercised by Tartan Setts that are available. As far as fine example, the Sikh Society in Scotland and the Rabbinical Society in Scotland. So they have their Tartan Setts, and nobody particularly worries about that this day. And it's really the Little Kilt that we're going to focus on for the purposes of this study, which Hugh Trevor Roper stated was a modern notion. Now, what is interesting in terms of the research is that for such a seminal event, the visit by George IV to Edinburgh in 1822, the first time in 177 years that a king had come back to Scotland, has actually been very, very poorly researched. The King's Jaunt, as it was described, 12 daft days. This is this image here is taken from Tartan Hill, when you can see the procession leading up towards the castle, going up to the east end of Princes Street. Now, the fullest account that actually exists of these 12 daft days was by John Preble in his 1988 book, The King's Jaunt. But that was never intended to be anything other than a counterpoint to Preble's own expose of the clearances, particularly in Sutherland. He was attacking, as a good communist himself, he was attacking the aristocracy and their failure to acknowledge that they were dispossessing people in the Highlands. Now, Prebble's oeuvre is largely disparaged by academia today and has been described by Tom Devine as a victim history. Now, we don't have time to discuss the 12 Daft Days here, but from the limited amount of examination of those events, it's fairly clear that there was no invention of any Highland garb as part of the pageants that were organised by Sir Walter Scott for the events that took place. Now, there was invention, but it was largely invention by those who were non-Gael. There were only 2,000 people who actually saw, now these invited guests actually saw the kilted figure of the king standing for 2 hours in the dimly lit corner of the Holyrood Palace levee room. George entered into the spirit of this with gusto. He spent a vast amount of money on his apparel. There were 42 yards of Royal Stuart tartan. David Wilkie's tidied him up a little bit. He was actually, you see that the pink pantaloons have disappeared and he's lost about 4 stone. He was actually described by one wag as nothing other than a rather tightly wrapped pink sausage. So this, but the point is that only 2,000 people saw him in the garb. Now, to suggest that, as Stuart Kelly of Scott and Scotland does, to suggest that this sight was equivalent to Prince Harry appearing in an SS uniform is clearly absurd. It was not absurd at all. There were many people appearing in Highland dress in Scotland, in its capital, particularly the returning victorious soldiers after the Napoleonic War, processing through Scotland's capital and being mobbed. So the notion of somebody appearing in a kilt was not absurd at all, in the slightest. What was irritating to people was Scott's requirement that everybody who turned up to the levee and was presented to the king would wear some form of tartan. Not necessarily the kilt itself, but a form of tartan, the garb of old Gaul, as Scott himself described it. But most of the subsequent discussion centred on the right to wear the kilt, not whether one wore a particular kind of set, but whether you had the right to wear it. And there was some fairly obnoxious writing, particularly led by Alistair Garrett, MacDonald of Glengarry at the time. But the point is that nobody at that stage was suggesting that the kilt was anything other than an old tradition or garment. The key person involved in supporting Scott in his efforts to try and present to the king what he wished to see, and I'll come back to that point, was his so-called dictator, according to Trevor Roper, Stuart of Garth, who himself, as a former military officer, had written a detailed history of the Highland regiments, his sketches, critically important. But let's now return to the kilt itself. And it's important here to stress that what Hugh Trevor Roper is discussing is the supposed invention of the little kilt. The little kilt. And that fact was very quickly lost in transmission. It very quickly became the invention of the kilt. Total. No distinction was being made between the Fianna Mór, the big fold, and the Fianna Big, the little fold. Hugh Trevor Roper cites 3 sources for the notion of the modern invention of the little kilt. 2 letters, and the recollection of the so-called Sobieski-Stewart brothers. I take it most people will know who I mean when I refer to the Sobieski-Stewart brothers, the 2 impostors called Allen, who claimed to have been descendants from Bonnie Prince Charlie, and wrote an awful lot of invented tradition. And if we are looking for invented tradition, that's where we do find it. I'll be coming back to the Sobieski-Stewarts later. Right, first to the 2, not a particularly good slide here, unfortunately, but here, these are the 2 letters that were written. Now, the first of the letters was claimed to have been written by one Evan Bailey of Abreachan, apparently in 1768, but not published until 1785 as part of the first edition of the Edinburgh Magazine in March of that year. Now, this magazine, which survived until 1803, had a circulation of between 600 and 700 copies. Now, what it actually says is that the letter, supposed by Bailey, states that about 50 years ago, one Thomas Rawlinson, an Englishman, conducted an ironworks carried out in the counties of Invergarry and Lochaber. He had a throng of Highlanders employed in his service. which I can aver as I became personally acquainted with him of over 40 years ago. He was a man of genius and quick parts, and thought it no great stretch of invention to abridge the dress and to make it handy and convenient for his workmen, and accordingly directed the using of the lower part, pleated, of which we call the filia, or kilt, and the upper part being set aside. So in other words, the filia more is essentially cut in half. The 12 yards of cloth are reduced to 6 yards, and you end up with simply an apron skirt rather than the full plate. This is what Evan Bailey is claiming. A little bit about Evan Bailey. Evan Bailey did exist. He was the younger brother of Alexander Bailey, second of Dochfwr, Floriat, 1670, and these dates seem to be about 1671 to 1715. That's his father, although the letter itself gives slightly different dates, Evan's own letter. Evan writes that he was a writer to the Signet in Edinburgh for about 7 or 8 years, returning to the Highlands since 1725. Simon Fraser of Lovat employed him on estate duties, and after the 45, he was a government agent for the forfeited estates in the area. Charles Fraser Mackintosh, in his great Antiquarian Notes and Historical, Genealogical and Social of 1894, has little good to say of Evan Bailey of Abriachan, but he does state that following Evan's death, sometime before 1784, his dubious land transactions had caused a legal dispute between the adjoining estates. The point here is that the letter writer was dead. The supposed letter writer was dead before his letter appeared. The one of Thomas Rawlinson himself. Now, according to Alfred Fell, 1908, the early iron industry of Furness, the Invergarry furnace operated from August 1729 to February 1736. Now, the Cumbrian Rawlinson had sole management and remained in Scotland throughout the 7-year life of the furnace. Although he was 38 years of age at the time he assumed management, he seems to have had no previous experience of managing a furnace. The furnace was not a success. Fell states, without source, that Rawlinson's management of Invergarry was noted chiefly for the invention and introduction into the Highlands of the little kilt. Fell also quotes extensively from the account books which were kept by Rawlinson, which provide a very detailed record of even the smallest amounts of sums paid out by Rawlinson, including 5 shillings for a Highlander who lost his plate in a flood. Strangely, there is no mention of the purchase of cloth or the production of the kilt for this throng of Highlanders. Nor is there any mention in Burke's roughly contemporary letters when he speaks of the Invergarry enterprise and of Rawlinson's travails, in particularly dealing with the MacDonnells of Invergarry. Fell tells us that Rawlinson died in 1737-38, his death some 30 years prior to the supposed Bailey letter, supposedly 1768, again means that the writer, there was no possibility of any corroboration with the letter. But I think it's important to understand, and I maintain that these letters, this particular letter was written in response to a request and to claim the little kilt's modernity. What the letter actually says is, you'll see it there, the key thing is in answer to your query, and the point that it is late than ancient. Now, this statement, the opening paragraph of the letter quite clearly states the purpose of the letter is to demonstrate this. So we have a statement being made by Evan, who in his letter makes the interesting point that his father, who was well known by Highlanders, also had not heard of this little kilt before that time. And so that Evan himself does not obviously claim to have a detailed knowledge of Highlanders. He claims simply to have known Evan Bailey, which of course he may well have had indeed known him, because the dates are approximately correct. So this is the first letter. If we now move on to the second letter, cited by Hugh Trevor Roper, that is also in response to a request for information, but here it's actually possible to identify the solicitor for that information. In November 1798, Scots Magazine published an anonymous letter to a Highland to a colonel of a Highland regiment entitled Origin of the Highland Dress. Roper, in his paper, identifies, only in footnotes, interestingly, the one thing I will say about Roper's essay, it's a remarkably well-written essay, remarkably well-written. Roper was a tremendous stylist. He wrote exceptionally well. But many of the information, many of the facts are held in footnotes. They're not actually quoted within the context of the main text of the paper itself. Footnotes tell us that the person who wrote the letter was one John Pilkington, and the letter was written on behalf of Sir John Sinclair of Ulster. Now, Sinclair of Ulster raised the Caithness Fencibles in 1794 and adopted, perhaps not surprisingly for a Caithness man, tartan trews rather than for the uniform of the Fencibles, rather than the then usual kilt. So here is Sir John Sinclair of Ulster. We know him better nowadays as being the man who started the statistical account and badgered poor ministers across Scotland to produce their statistical accounts, on one occasion threatening to billet his fencibles on the poor minister unless he delivered the said account. But Mitchison, there's a quite short and pithy biography by Rosalind Mitchison on agriculturalist Sir John, and it seems to be that Sinclair there are some rather funny stories within the book itself, but I think the key point to note is that Sinclair tended to lack judgment and he had the ability to put his foot in it. But we just let you see the song that he also wrote for his fencibles. So it's fairly clear then that John Sinclair of Ulster had determined that he was going to put his men into tartan trews. And that immediately created a question as to whether or not he was right so to do when most of the other Highland regiments were being kitted out in the Filia Mór, which was what they would conventionally wear. So we know from Trevor Roper that the letter writer was John Pinkerton, rather. Now, Pinkerton claims Hugh Trevor Roper claims that Pinkerton was the first scholar to document the history of Highland dress. That's not actually correct, but Pinkerton did write about the Highlands. Unfortunately for Hugh Trevor Roper's thesis, Pinkerton had moved to London in 1781 and therefore completely unaware of Bailey's letter on the origins of the kilt in Glengarry, and he offers a completely different and alternative invention myth. So this is what Pinkerton thinks that the kilt's ancestor is, Eau de Chaux, and this is an example of that particular garment. So this is what he quotes in his letter. So we have two possible progenitors for the kilt itself. Interestingly, although Hugh Trevor Roper quotes extensively from Pinkerton's letter, he suppresses the fact in his paper that Pinkerton has suggested the kilt, the modern kilt, the little kilt, had come from this particular garb. So that fact is just skited over, it's just completely ignored. Now, the 1830 editors of Pinkerton's correspondence published the letter, which was originally written in February 1795, and the immediately preceding page published Sinclair's response to that letter of May 1796, which the editors had helpfully included out of its chronological order to bring it into contact with the proceeding in which it was enclosed by Sir John to Mr. Pinkerton. So what does that letter actually say? What does Sinclair say to Pinkerton after receiving his letter? So what he says is, Sir John Sinclair sends herein his paper Pinkerton's paper on the Highland dress. He accidentally found Mr. Pinkerton's observations on the subject, which he returns. Sir John thinks that the word eau de Chaux mean trousers and not the Philippic. Indeed, it is well known that the Philippic was invented by an Englishman in Lochaber about 60 years ago, who naturally thought his workforce could be more active in the light petticoat than in the belted plaid, and that it was more decent to wear it than to have no clothing at all, which was the case with some of those employed by him cutting down the woods of Lochaber. A nice piece of anthropology there. Now, what this letter does actually state, though, is that on the back of the letter, the Pinkerton letter, which was published in the Scots Magazine, there's an NB on the back which says the letter, on the back of this letter is a note from the Colonel that the Philippic was invented by an Englishman in Scotland about 60 years ago, i.e. 1705. So we're beginning to deal with a sort of confused chronology here. But again, the key thing about this is that what Pinkerton is supplying is corroboration for a request for information from Sinclair, because what actually Pinkerton says at the very beginning of his letter, it's in compliance with your desire. So again, Pinkerton is supporting an argument being made by Sinclair for the to argue that the little kilt is a modern invention and it would be as appropriate to wear pantaloons or trews as to wear the kilt. And of course, Pinkerton goes on at the very end of his letter just to confirm that, that if universally introduced by the Highland regiments and into the Highlands, it would be a laudable improvement. So he's pushing a particular line in relation to this. Now, finally, the last piece of information are the Sobieski Stuarts, the Allen brothers. The Allen brothers, or the self-styled Sobieski Stuart brothers, muddy the waters further by recounting the story themselves with slightly different details in the 1845 work, Costumes of the Highlands. They date the event to 1715 and give the credit to a Mr. Pinkerton. So Pinkerton reappears, but he's now, at this stage, he's transmogrified into a regimental tailor who visited Rawlinson and had the idea, it was his idea, not Rawlinson's, to separate the upper and lower portions of the plaid. So that's what the Sobieski Stuarts claim. So we have a different invention tradition developing here. So while Roper states, which is completely untrue, that the Wilkinson invention claim was confirmed by the two greatest authorities on Scottish costumes then living, supposedly Sinclair and Pinkerton, both men would have been rather surprised by that suggestion that they were supposed experts on Highland costumes and traditions. And he then claims, Hugh Trevor Roper, that it's corroborated by the independent testimony from the Glengarry family, which of course it's not. All he's saying is that in fact this tradition was repeated by the Sobieski Stuart. It's not directly from the Glengarrys at all. No Macdonnell is involved in this. It's actually the Sobieski Stuarts he's quoting. And later on in the paper, well away from this particular statement, Hugh Trevor Roper makes the mark about the Allen brothers' work, because he goes on to discuss Vestarium Scotorum, the great book on tartan sets. He says that nothing that they, the Allen brothers, can be immediately discounted. On the other hand, nothing can be taken on trust. The book is shot through with pure invention and bare-faced forgery. So, despite the fact he acknowledges later on in the letter, that in his essay, that no substance can be given to the Sobieski Stuarts, he's willing to use their corroboration of the Glengarry story earlier on in his essay. Roper goes on to claim that the Wilkinson invention claim was not challenged for another 40 years. It has never been refuted. All the evidence that has since accumulated is consistent with it. Roper quotes in his essay J. Telfer Dunbar's excellent work, The History of Highland Dress, 1962. If anybody's interested, there's a very good copy of it sitting in Caledonia Books and on Kelvin Bridge at the moment. They're closed for weeks, so you'll have to rush around Monday morning and get it. Dunbar's is a very good book indeed, and clearly Hugh Trevor Roper had written it. And having read it, he was perfectly well aware that Telfer quotes Stuart of Garth, Roper's so-called dictator of the 1822 pageant. And he would have known, in reading and quoting from Dunbar, that Stuart of Garth had objected strongly to the suggestion of the invention of the kilt. And this is Stuart of Garth himself here, the dictator of the 1822 pageants. He's wearing the figured pig himself. Now, this is actually quoted by Browne in 1838. So the point is essentially that we notice here again the confusion of names. Garth is describing him as Parkinson, but he was actually Wilkinson. But here, Garth is very clear that he doesn't want to give this supposed invention story any oxygen. He believes that it's not worth contradicting. So Hugh Trevor Roper would have been aware, perfectly well aware, that the original story had raised considerable contention at the time of the King's visit in 1822. Nor was Sir Walter Scott himself hallucinated by a Celtic conspiracy, as is claimed by Hugh Trevor Roper. He quotes selectively from Scott's letter to MacLeod of MacLeod in Skye, when he says to him, Do come and bring half a dozen or half a score of clansmen. Highlanders are what he, the king, will like best to see. So what we've actually got here is Scott recognising fully that the king is intent on seeing Highlanders, is then trying to organise as many Highlanders in Edinburgh as he can. It's a nice example of stage authenticity. It's a very good, it's probably one of the earliest examples of stage authenticity in Lucy McCannell's thesis. Scott is presenting for the king something that he seeks to see. In that letter, which is quoted by Hugh Trevor Roper does not, of course, quote the end of that particular sentence, because what Scott goes on to say, the masquerade of the Highland society will not do without some of the real stuff to bear it out. So therefore Scott, very focused on authenticity himself, was very keen to have proper Highlanders turning up, rather than the activity that Alistair Garrett of MacDonald was getting up to through the Celtic Society. In order to support his thesis, Hugh Trevor Roper also quotes another Whig politician, Thomas Babington Macaulay, who he claims was obviously of Highland origin, which indeed he was. Again, Roper quotes the aphorism of the kilt as being, this is Macaulay, before the Union considered by 9 Scotchmen out of 10 as the dress of a thief. But again, Hugh Trevor Roper ignores Macaulay's further words, which was that Gaelic manners have never been exhibited in the simple light of truth, and that the jibe, the garb of a thief, was of course a coarse caricature. These are prophetic words for 1848. So what exactly was Hugh Trevor Roper up to? First, I better say a little bit about the man himself, who was obviously Regis Professor of history at Oxford University, a position that he had fought extremely hard and pulled a huge number of strings to achieve. He actually published extremely little in his day. There was no, in searching for the great work of the Regis Professor, there is none. He never actually produced a great work. He was essentially a polemicist. He's probably best known in popular imagination for this particular incident. This is Private Eye's caricature of Munich 38, when Neville Chamberlain returns from seeing Mr. Hitler. I have a paper with Mr. Hitler's signature. Hugh Trevor Roper stupidly authenticated the Hitler diaries, and of course that destroyed his reputation completely. But before that happened, we should be aware about where he came from. Hugh Trevor Roper, he was a Northumbrian. He had been educated briefly in Scotland, just outside Dunbar, in a preparatory school, which seemed to have seared him somewhat. He then went on to, he was an undergraduate at Oxford, and he spent almost all his life at Oxford, but subsequently transferred to become Master of Peterhouse. He was invited to become Master of Peterhouse by the fellows there, who regarded him mistakenly as a not conservative. Trevor Roper was not ultra-conservative. He was a Whig. He was a traditional Whig. But interestingly enough, he had been, during the war, an intelligence officer, specializing in deception tactics, long after he maintained a close friendship with Dick White, who was head of both MI5 and MI6, and he moved in political circles, 3 prime ministers. So he was clearly in. The final thing that he did was he actually spied on his left-wing colleagues on behalf of MI5. He was renowned as a controversialist and as a polemicist. Some of his contemporary views of him include the following. I think the last, yes, let's see this one here. This is a particularly valuable contribution by his friend, also. This was Hugh Trevor Roper's attempt to try and undermine the Warren Commission on the assassination of Kennedy. He seriously annoyed the American establishment by suggesting the Warren Commission was actually inaccurate. And he had a tendency to do this. He also succeeded Roper succeeded in annoying the Jews and the Swedish royal family. He had a go at anybody, in fact. So the Scotch, he always called them Scotch. He deliberately used the pejorative term Scotch when talking about Scotland and the Scots, the Scotch. He never set out specifically to alienate the Scots. He was doing it to everybody who came up into his purview. But what about the timing of this particular paper, the invention, the Highland tradition, invention of the Highland tradition? Summer of 1977, to Hobsbawm's gathering of left-wing academics. Hardly a congenial environment, somebody who was supposedly an ultra-conservative. Now, Colin Kidd, Professor Colin Kidd, has acknowledged a political motive, but he unhelpfully suggests in 1994 that Roper was a Northumbrian, keenly aware of his ancestral duty to harry the Scots. So that's not particularly helpful, but he does acknowledge the political component. Adam Sisman, who is Roper's biographer, was much more accurate when he says that the writing of the Scotch, writing on the Scotch, became for Roper urgent to him in the late 1970s during the campaign for Scottish devolution. He was repelled, Roper, by Scotch nationalism's appeal to atavistic tribal loyalties. So Roper campaigned actively against the devolution bill between December 1976 and February 1979. Roper prepared and delivered at least 10 works directed against Scotch devolution. He delivered talks, lectures, a TV appearance, a book review. He wrote letters to the Sunday Telegraph, 2 articles to the Times, one entitled Scotching the Myths of Devolution, in April and September 1976, and one for the Scotsman that August. His paper to the Past and Present Conference at Oxford was in the midst of that flurry of activity. The kilt, of course, wasn't his sole target. Trevor Roper was also having a considerable go at James Macpherson and Ossian. Both Fiona Stafford and William Ferguson have noted Roper's attacks on Macpherson's Ossian and his account of Highland illiteracy and cultural deprivation, echoing remarkably strongly and strangely Samuel Johnston's view of the Ossianic works as being another proof of Scotch conspiracy in national falsehood. So, in a sense, what we have here is Hugh Trevor Roper picking up directly from that attack by Samuel Johnston of poor James Macpherson. Stafford's view is that Roper adopted a similarly judgmental attitude towards Macpherson, presenting his case with a prejudice surpassing anything displayed by Johnston. So they were really quite vituperative, these articles. However, despite Roper's best efforts, the bill passed and attention turned to the referendum of March 1979. Hugh Trevor Roper kept up his opposition right to the bitter end with a piece to the Spectator in February 1979 when he urged Scots voters to reject Labour's shabby project. As we know, the referendum did not deliver a positive result for the Labour government, and it fell. Margaret Thatcher won the general election on the 3rd of May 1979, and 28 days later, Hugh Trevor Roper received an offer of a life peerage from her. He feigned mystification, but it was a political appointment, as both he himself and Lord Noel Annan knew perfectly well. This is what Annan said. Hugh Trevor Roper had never been knighted. He never was to be knighted. He was regarded with some repugnance by the civil service. Thatcher recognised Roper's value as a polemicist. She scolded him for weak book production. Sisman quotes an aphorism for Thatcher, who says, when Roper was at a dinner party, she asked him about his book writing, and he said that they were on the stocks. And she said, "On the stocks? A fat lot of good, that is. In the shops, that's where it should be." So she recognised his value. Of course, the book never appeared, and so many, as it was the case with so many of Hugh Trevor Roper's projects, the impetus for it, the reason had moved on. He was moving on to something else. The book never appeared in his lifetime, so therefore the paramount exemplar of invented edition rests solely on the past and present conference paper. It was only with the ultimate compilation in 2008 and the publication of The Invention of Scotland of Roper's extensive writings by his American publisher, Jeremy Cater, that we understand the failure to publish, because Cater states quite immediately, for the polemical origin of the impulse to write the book, no apology is surely necessary. Cater also helpfully explains candidly that the previous government, this is the Labour government's proposals for Scottish devolution, were shelved for an infinite period. For Hugh Trevor Roper, that removed the spur to action. We do have to question Cater's assertion, which he makes, what he suggests. I believe my paper and my analysis of the original 1977 essay in Invention of Tradition does not bear out this assertion by Cater, that there is, to my mind, a quite deliberate obfuscation, confusion, and deliberate misrepresentation of the facts. However, having said that, we come back to Murray Pittock's original statement. It was the authority of the Regius Professor of History at Oxford University making this statement that carried forward this notion, so that to this day it is still possible for people such as Heffer to actually suggest that not only was the traditional garb of the Highlanders invented by a lowlander, but that we were also cannibalistic at the same time. Again, a classic neo-colonial trope, just a trait. Cannibalism is usually used as a way of demeaning a society. But I fear that until this research has been done and we get a better publication and understanding of Hugh Trevor Roper's motivations, we will not have a chance, as Macaulay sought in 1848, to have a true exhibition of Gaelic manners in the simple light of truth. After all, we still deal with the situation. I myself, as a Blue Badge tourist guide, always coming across statements by people who say to me, "Oh, I read that the kilt was invented, the tartan was invented, the kilt was invented by an Englishman." So, despite the fact you see Highland garb all across Edinburgh and all across Scotland, admittedly in a form which we would have to acknowledge, looking at this piper, that you're actually looking at a late 19th century parade dress army uniform, nonetheless to suggest that the little kilt was invented by an Englishman in 1727 is based solely on a single letter of very, very questionable provenance. And clearly it is not an ethnographic statement, it is a statement drawn from an individual who was responding to a request for information and a desire to suggest Kilt was of modern origin. Thank you.